Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Buckeye Weekly podcast. I am not Tony Gerdeman. I am Tom Orr. Tony Gerdeman is, let's just say he's on assignment. What the heck? Joined today instead by our good buddy Kevin Noon, longtime friend of the program. He is down in San Antonio at the All-American Bowl. Kevin, how's it going?
That was powerful. I don't know if that was powerful enough in the pause, but I'm doing well. Not exactly as warm in San Antonio as you might think, but climate is not my game, and football is, and I'm looking forward to finishing out the week here in San Antonio with many of Ohio State's top signees from the class of 2024, and then be able to get back to Columbus, Ohio, and hear all the reasons why people are unhappy with Ohio State football.
Oh, that's a whole separate show. This show, I think, is mostly good news for Ohio State fans. If you want to hear more about the All-American Bowl, we will probably talk to Kevin a little bit about that towards the end of the show. But Kevin and Mark dropped an episode of the Skull Session podcast on Wednesday night, talking all about the stuff that they've seen, the stuff that they've heard. That's always a great place to meet connections, get some inside scoop there. So you can find that on the Skull Session podcast feed, or you can find it at youtube.com/Buckeye Huddle. So, all right, that's the recruiting piece. We may take a look at that a little later on if we have enough time. But do you want to talk about the transfer portal today? Two pieces of news about potential incoming transfer portal targets for the Buckeyes. Two pieces of news about former Buckeyes who have found new homes. Let's start with the incoming news, Kevin. And the first piece, when we start with the transfer portal, we got to start with the quarterback. That's what everyone wants to hear about. And it's a name that we've talked about for seemingly weeks now. Former Kansas State quarterback Will Howard visiting the Buckeyes this week. It feels like this is, I don't know if inevitable is maybe a little too strong, but it sure feels like Will Howard is trending towards ending up as an Ohio State Buckeye.
Yeah, that seems to be the case. Ohio State really had not gotten its name put out a ton in its own volition on transfer quarterbacks. Everybody out there wanted to connect Ohio State to Cam Ward and everything else, but it seems that Will Howard may be the guy. I mean, that is obviously corroborated by the fact that Ohio State is going to have Howard in on a visit. I really think that coming out of that visit, we could hear some news, and that would be positive news in Ohio State's favor there. We've seen how the dominoes have fallen at this point. We know who's kind of looking for a quarterback. USC was a team that was mentioned for Will Howard. Well, their quarterback, Miller Moss, comes out and throws like 600 touchdowns in USC's bowl game. Maybe that diminishes their need a little bit. Ohio State probably happy to get this visit at least in place for Will Howard, as you still have Miami out there trying to figure out its quarterback situation, a couple other programs there. You have to make these decisions because we all know, I mean, it was Nebraska head coach Matt Rule comes out and it's like, oh, $1 million, $1.5 million for a transfer quarterback out of the portal. I think he kind of came in with like Nebraska dollar figures because that's a little low. I think it's a little bit higher right now, and you just don't necessarily want to get into a bidding war there. But one of the things, and I think we're going to talk about this here in a second, is people are just taking his numbers from K-State and figuring that it is an apples to apples comparison, and that what he did in the Little Apple in Manhattan, Kansas, is what he would do in Columbus, with very different rooms around him, very different schedules, things all of that nature. It's just, it's something to sit there and see somebody who has not even made the visit to a school already getting largely panned by some people just because there is not a Caleb Williams or Drake May, per se, in the portal this year, or that the fact that the grass is greener somewhere else with Liberty's quarterback going into the portal. And just, it's funny. Whenever I see a portal name come up on social, there's generally a long line, regardless of position or name or results or anything, of Ohio State fans saying, hand praying emoji, please come to Ohio State. Okay, I mean, we're talking about 11-2 team that, came up short against Michigan and no-showed, at least offensively, against Missouri, but we're not talking about a team that is, two guys out of 22 deep in terms of what it needs to be.
Well, and you mentioned the stats for Will Howard, so let's run through those real quick. 59.8 and 61.3% completions the last two seasons. totaled 4,276 yards over those 2 seasons, 39 touchdowns, 14 picks. He was really a starter for about a season and a half. He only started 7 games in 2022, started the whole season this year. He's someone who I think might bring something a little different. He's not Caleb Williams, but he might bring something a little bit different to Ohio State. Ohio State looked at Devin Brown, who's 6'3" and listed at 213 pounds, and said, that's the running quarterback who could run inside and be the guy who really brings an added dimension with his legs to the offense. Will Howard, I think you look at Will Howard running in the open field compared to what you've seen from Devin Brown so far. I think Will Howard looks like he might be a better runner. Will Howard is also an inch taller and 22 pounds heavier than Devin Brown. So I think if you were an Ohio State fan who has been wondering where is the quarterback sneak, where is the brotherly shove play, I think you might see it if Will Howard comes to town. Where if you've been the Ohio State fan who's been wondering for a couple of years, hey, C.J. Stroud, Kyle McCord, they haven't been running the ball very much. What happened to the read option? What happened to all that stuff? You might see that a little more with Will Howard. And the passing numbers, as you said, are not incredible. I mean, it's basically 60% and basically, it was, I think, 24 touchdowns and 10 interceptions or something like that this year. Not dissimilar from Kyle McCord numbers, but as you said, it's not apples to apples. You're working with, number one, it's going to be a different offense than what he was running in Kansas State. And number two, you're also working with substantially better wide receivers in Ohio State as well.
And that's the thing. And I think that, first to address the running things, none of that's going to matter if Ohio State doesn't fix its offensive line. I don't care who you've got. Some of these issues are a result of the fact that your offensive linemen are not only not getting into the second level, you're getting your ball carrier contacted 3 yards deep in the backfield, and that's going to be a big issue. And I don't care if you're 6'8", 265 and run like the wind; it's not necessarily going to matter at that point. As for Will Howard's passing numbers, yeah, he's a little too inaccurate. He's certainly a little intercepty for me in terms of what his interception numbers are, but again, I think that I think that the completion percentage goes up in terms of what offense Ohio State runs, and I think it goes up with receivers that are much better suited. That they have bigger catch radiuses, they can make you look better. If you have it off a little bit, it's not necessarily going to go as an interception or fall to the ground as an incompletion. I think a lot of those balls could be caught by Ohio State's receivers. But, it would be interesting because you just don't know. And for every transfer that goes in and works out, there are 3 transfers out there that don't work out. And I've certainly mentioned names in other shows, and I just don't want to keep beating up on the same kids. That's not fair to them. It just happens. But I think the thing with the Will Howard, too, is he is somebody who certainly wants to be told, you're coming in and you're going to be the guy. He's going to be told you're going to come in and you're going to compete for the position. And you've got to do that to try and maintain your quarterback room. Because if not, you sit there and say, well, sorry, little Timmy, I'm going to bring in this other guy to pitch. And, why don't you go scrub the fungo bat while you're at it? I mean, nobody's going to want to stick around for that. So it's a balancing act, but I'm glad to see Ohio State finally apparently moving forward in its decision, because honestly, we did not get an opportunity to make any sort of judgment out of the Cotton Bowl. Devin Brown gets hurt, is knocked out of the game. We don't get to see anything there. And then whatever you believe the instances of how much or how little look Lincoln Kienholz got during the 15, 12, 13, 6, whatever number you believe of practices out there, he was thrown into an impossible situation. So we don't have any answer whatsoever of what is in reserve at Ohio State. But we do know it seems that they're at least entertaining the idea about bringing another body in.
Yeah, and we'll see whether Will Howard ends up committing to Ohio State, signing with Ohio State. That is all still TBD. He is going to be in for a visit, so the interest is real. It is, mutual, and we'll see where it goes from there. Without having the Cotton Bowl reps on Devin Brown to watch, you kind of want to kick the can on this decision a little bit. I agree with what you said there. He's not coming in and being guaranteed the starting job. He's being coming in and being guaranteed a chance to compete for the starting job. Those are very different things. If you can go through 15 practices in the spring with Will Howard, if he does in fact sign with Ohio State, with Devin Brown, with Lincoln Kienholz, well, that gives you three pretty good options. And Aaron Nolan, of course, coming in as a true freshman, I think you kind of have to put him in a separate bucket for now as a true freshman. Going to be a good one eventually, most likely, but probably a little early to be competing for the starting job this year. But another option in that room is not going to be a bad thing for Ohio State. So you mentioned earlier, well, they've got to figure out their offensive line too. Well, Kevin, how about a little patience? They're trying. Stop being so pushy. They brought in Derrick Graham, a tackle from Troy. He was the starting left tackle for the Troy Trojans out of Troy, Alabama, this season out of the Sun Belt. He had 532 pass blocking snaps, according to PFF, gave up 3 sacks, 13 hurries. That's pretty good numbers. He graded out by PFF's numbers as a better pass blocker than a run blocker. He was not an all-conference player in the Sun Belt. So, the numbers are sort of encouraging. He still has 2 years left, so this might be a little bit of a Josh Simmons situation where you could come in and maybe you start year one, but maybe he's a little bit more of a longer-term prospect as well. I think this is whatever you think of Derrick Graham, and I have seen all sorts of different opinions on him coming up to visit from Troy. This feels like Ohio State publicly raising their hands and saying, we recognize that we don't have enough depth on the offensive line, and we are going to do our best to address it, which that feels like no matter what you think of Derrick Graham individually, it sure seems like that's probably a positive development for Ohio State fans as well.
Yeah, and I think that bringing him in, and you mentioned that maybe it's a little bit more of a longer play with him having 2 years of eligibility, and if he can be there in 24, that's great. But certainly know what you have in 25. I think you've got to bring him in. You got to be trying to find guys, and it's got to be mutual. You just can't say I want you, you, and you, and it just happens. You have to come to an agreement. I think it's important for them to make some adjustments. And we look at what the offensive line is going to be moving forward. We know Matthew Jones moves on. That opens up a guard position at that point. We still have to wait on a decision from Donovan Jackson. What's going to happen there? What does 2024 look like for Carson Hinsman at center? In a perfect world, you bring in a tackle, and then you have Simmons and tackle TBD as your tackles. You have Donovan Jackson who returns at one guard. You kick Josh Fryer into another guard position, and then whether it's Carson Hinsman, whether it's Jacob James, whatever the case is, you have to figure out what you're going to do at center at this point. But I really feel that coming out of last season, I think that Josh Fryer is a guard. I really do. So I think that this type of move is incredibly important. Ohio State put a lot of eggs in the basket of trying to land Chase Besantis, formerly of A&M, who's now currently of A&M after he withdrew from the portal. You've got to find a tackle at this point. I think you've got to find a tackle and a guard. I think because the depth isn't there. The depth isn't there. The fact that Ohio State got into the predicament that it did in the Cotton Bowl of having to shift some things over, and when it was obvious that Enoch Vamahi was not having a great night, they had nowhere to go. It was checkmate at that point because there was just not a situation of how they could shuffle things around since Carson Hinsman did not have, by all accounts, a good lead up into the bowl game. So having him at center was not necessarily going to work. Matt Jones didn't necessarily have a great night at center himself. All of this just goes to show that we have our starters, we have our freshmen, and then we have some guys. And you need to have more starters and freshmen and less guys. And that's the problem is Ohio State just recruited a lot of guys under Greg Studrawa. And they're trying to fix that. And people have been coming after offensive line coach Justin Fry with a lot of vim and vigor here recently about what is going on in that room. And he just can't get some of these things turned over quickly enough.
Yeah, it does feel like there's a lot of possible solutions in that room. And I don't think you mentioned Luke Montgomery's name. He's a possibility at right tackle. That was something that I think a lot of people have thrown around as you put him at right tackle. You kick Josh Fryer inside. I know Taker Shabola is still in the mix there. Jacob James has transferred. He's out at Toledo now, but Carson Hinsman is a possibility at center, but you don't know, yet. A bad bowl practice, does that, when the calendar flips, does that then not become a problem anymore, or is that a lingering problem? There's a lot of possible questions and a lot of possible solutions in there, but as you said, with them going to their sixth offensive lineman, Enoch Famahi, and it looking like that I think has to be a concern about, okay, so what does that mean about offensive linemen 7 and 8 and 9 in that room? Because it's never fair to ask a true freshman like Luke Montgomery to have to step up and play as a true freshman in the offensive line. That's just almost never, ever happens at the college level, especially at the high level college level. So maybe he's a solution moving forward, but you've got a bunch of guys who were true freshmen last year. They had 3 other true freshmen, true offensive linemen last year. Maybe we'll see. You got Zen Michalski, who was supposed to be in the mix for tackle and then just sort of fell off the board at one point this fall. So there's a lot of names in that room. They gotta get that sorted out during the spring. And this is, I think, to me, a lot like the Will Howard thing, where throw another couple names in the mix, and what's the worst that can happen? You're giving yourself more possible options. You're not going to hit on 100%. They brought in 2 transfer offensive linemen last year. Vic Cutler, who definitely did not work out and is back in the portal now, and Josh Simmons, who very much did work out and ended up the year one of their better offensive linemen, and like Derrick Graham, has a little bit more eligibility left, so not just a 1-year patch, but potentially a multi-year solution. So Derrick Graham is visiting Pitt on Thursday. He's visiting Texas A&M on Friday. He's visiting Missouri on Saturday. So far from a given that Derrick Graham ends up a Buckeye, but certainly a name for Ohio State fans to know there. Now, as far as the outbound portal news, couple names to know here. Julian Fleming, who in my mind had signed with Nebraska like 3 weeks ago. That was the only school you heard linked to Julian Fleming for weeks. I thought for sure he had already signed and was affiliated at Nebraska. Turns out, not so fast myself. That is Julian Fleming going back to the place where when Julian Fleming first entered the portal, I thought it would make a lot of sense for him to go back to Penn State. He is from Central Pennsylvania. He was rumored to be potentially flipping to Penn State quite a bit when he was in high school, ended up signing with Ohio State, played 3 years with the Buckeyes. Now, Kevin, he is headed back to his native Central Pennsylvania to go play for James Franklin and the Nittany Lions.
Yeah, and I think it's a nice pickup for them. I mean, you hope for Julian. You don't hope for Penn State as much, I don't think, that Julian is able to put together a full season where there's not that nagging, creeping injury that slows him down at this point. I mean, the problem is he kept waiting. And waiting is the wrong term. He was being told to wait. You're going to be the guy this year. You're going to be involved there. And Ohio State is just still going through its run of incredible wide receivers. And next year is not going to be any different. I mean, obviously, waiting on the decision of Emeka Egbuka. It sounds like he's going to be back. I mean, you've got Brandon Ennis and Carnell Tate. Oh, by the way, you've got the number 1 recruit in the class of 2024 in Jeremiah Smith, and Mylan Graham is another 5-star, so he ain't half bad either. It just wasn't going to be there for Julian. But now he goes to Penn State, a team that is still trying to sort some things out. Drew Allard looked a little bit better in the bowl game than maybe he looked certainly in the biggest games of the season against Michigan and against Ohio State. Penn State loses Dante Cephas, who was a Kent State transfer in there. He's transferred out. So there's going to be ample opportunity. I guess the question is going to be, what does that James Franklin offense look like? Because it's been a hot minute since we've gone through Penn State and said, oh, yeah, XYZ has really gone out there and kicked butt as a receiver. It just has not been there, whether it's been the offense or maybe some of the shortcomings of Sean Clifford or whatever that may be.
And it's going to be interesting to see what Penn State looks like next year, because they are turning over both coordinator positions. Mike Yurcich fired, Manny Diaz took the Duke job. So both coordinators getting turned over there. Second year for Drew Aller. They lost their all-world offensive tackle. And you mentioned Dante Cephas. I thought for all the world he was going to go in and make a real impact there. And then I think he finished with something like 16 catches for 160 yards. So not necessarily. Julian Fleming, he played 4 years. I'm going to correct myself. I think I said 3 earlier. Played 4 years with the Buckeyes. Just never quite was healthy enough to be a super consistent player for them. best season for the Buckeyes. His junior year in 2022, 34 catches, 533 yards, 6 touchdowns. But I think the last touchdown he caught was about halfway through the 2022 season. Finished 2023, 26 catches, 270 yards, no touchdowns all season, which seems crazy for someone as talented as Julian Fleming to go an entire season in the Ohio State offense and not catch a touchdown. But he will move on to Penn State. The Buckeyes will see him next year. They go to play at Penn State, so a little bit of a reunion there on deck. I am struggling to think, Kevin, of a scenario where the Buckeyes would play Vanderbilt next year. But if they do, things have either gone surprisingly well for the Commodores or extremely poorly for the Buckeyes. And if that does happen, they will see their former punter, Jesse Mirco. He committed to Vanderbilt. He went in the portal after the Cotton Bowl, committed to the Commodores. This one is still a little bit weird to me. I think you could sort of explain it with, well, he graduated from Ohio State, and this is a great opportunity to go to a really highly ranked grad school and punt in the SEC. Does it have to do with the status of Parker Fleming moving forward as Ohio State special teams coordinator? This is all just kind of an open question, but this is where Jesse Mirco leaves, and now I don't know what the Buckeyes plan as a punter because they brought in Joe McGuire, who is, like Mirco, an Australian punter. He came as a walk-on last year, so maybe he's the in-house replacement. Or do they go in the portal? I mean, any thoughts on Jesse Mirco, new Vanderbilt Commodore?
That one, the whole thing has kind of caught me by surprise. And the truth of the matter is, go back to the Cotton Bowl. Not only is Ohio State's punter in the portal, but Missouri's punter went into the portal as well. So I think they both got so much work in that game. They figure it out. They've rounded out their tapes for their respective universities, and it was time to move on. Of course, the joke here that has already written itself is, by going to Vanderbilt, he will have plenty of action because Vanderbilt has not really gotten any better. The SEC has gotten 2 teams deeper, and here we stand. But yeah, I think there is an opportunity for him. He already has his Ohio State degree in hand, and Jesse Mirco has an opportunity to go to grad school, could really have a nice, prestigious graduate degree. So that's something to be said there. As for the Parker Fleming news, we'll wait and see. I think that everybody gets on social in the morning, in the evening, and many times in between is today the day that we start to see some of the moves happening with the Ohio State coaching staff? As of the time of recording this, that answer would be no. But, it may be coming at this point. We also saw Max LaMonica, one of the long snappers, go into the portal as well. So I was like, oh, here we come. It's coming. It's happening here at this point, and it hasn't yet. But I don't know. I don't know how to describe that one. I know a couple staffers at Vanderbilt have not had a chance to reach out to them. Don't know how much they'd be able to tell me anyway at this point. I'm sure they're happy to have him. He has had a really solid Ohio State career, and now, Ohio State's going to have to kind of figure out whether or not it's its walk-on Aussie is going to be its scholarship Aussie, or how it's going to handle it, or if it has to go get somebody else out there. But of course, the hope is that Ohio State doesn't have to punt a lot this next year. But we had a lot of hopes going into 23 as well.
Some of that may hinge on the first couple guys we talked about in this conversation, and anyone else in the who they may be adding in the portal over the next few months. It is going to be a busy few months there. We also want to talk real briefly before I let you go, Kevin. Just give us your 1 or 2 takeaways on the Ohio State players that you have seen down there in San Antonio this week.
Well, I'd be remiss if I didn't lead off with Jeremiah Smith, the nation's #1 player, according to almost every service out there. He's as good as advertised. He's at an event here with many of the top players from his class. There are a couple of all-star games, so the pool gets diluted a little bit. But Jeremiah Smith is an alien and looks, just is cut differently than a lot of these guys. So you have him there. And then on the defensive side, I really like what I've seen out of Edric Houston, another 5-star in the Ohio State class. Today, or I guess on Wednesday, it was a more physical practice. They'll probably back off for Thursday, but these camp events are not necessarily built for these bull rusher type of guys because they want to safety. I mean, they are playing in helmets and pads, so you can go a little bit rougher here. And today was one of those days, and you really saw that that quick first step and that motor. But all 5 of the main Buckeyes that are here, and I guess also their long snappers here too on the West team. We've not had a chance really to see much of the West team. all look good in their own ways. They're all going to have their own timeline. So just because somebody isn't necessarily out there as quick as Jeremiah Smith, don't look into that much. Jeremiah Smith is a freak.
Well, that's I think encouraging and pretty consistent news on Jeremiah Smith and some of the other Buckeyes down there: James Peoples, Ian Moore, Morrow Evans, the long snapper, in addition to Edric Houston and Jeremiah Smith. So lots more on all of that stuff. Again, as I mentioned off the top of the show, you can find Kevin and Mark Givler talking in depth about all those guys, what they've seen this week, what they've learned this week on the Skull Session podcast. Just search for Skull Session wherever you find this and other podcasts, or you can just find it on YouTube at youtube.com/Buckeye Huddle. Mark and Kevin did a nice update show right before we recorded this one, so you can get a lot more detail on that there. So that will do it for this show. Thank you guys all for joining us. If you have not already hit the thumbs up, please hit the thumbs up. That helps other folks find these shows on YouTube. If you're listening on your podcast platform of choice, leave us a 5-star rating and review. That also helps other folks find these shows. And finally, you want to talk more to Tony and Kevin and me and Mark and Ross and the whole team, you can do that at BuckeyeHuddle.com, specifically on the Huddle board presented by Jeff Ruby's Columbus, one of the finest steakhouses in America, named one of the top 50 steakhouses in America. They sponsor our board. They make some pretty darn delicious food. You can find more about them at jeffruby.com/Columbus. And you can find more about Ohio State football and basketball and everything else, recruiting, transfer portal news, all of that on the Huddle board there if you are a member at BuckeyeHuddle.com. Thank you guys all for joining us. We'll talk to you next time.